All right, good morning. So the weather is getting bad, so I'm going to try and zip through this because I have a meeting at 11:45, and I can drive over there. So I apologize if you feel cheated because I'm going to let you go early. You just let me know if we'll stay late. It's a Thursday, but it will also give you some time to work on the critical thinking challenge. So for this week's critical thinking challenge, I want you to tell me whether or not organizations are more rational than irrational or rational than individuals. So I made an argument that really maybe individual consumers don't follow what we call the rational action model. That maybe they follow the hybrid model depending on the risk, but even then I gave you an example of how consumers can behave irrationally, and I told you about the carpet example in a house purchase. A totally rational buyer would not care that the carpet looked bad if they got an offset or an allowance for the carpeting. They would rather have their own carpet choice, but they can't visualize that. And so I'm not sure that consumers really are as rational as we think they are. Now for getting bonus points for this one, I will tell you that the easy answer is that organizations are more rational than individuals. That's the easy one to do. The one that will probably get you bonus points is to argue that organizations are just as irrational as individuals. It's easy to make an argument that organizations are rational based on the text, the stuff in the text. You'll have to go beyond the text to make the argument that they're not. You should consider all three levels, nonprofit, profit, and governmental. You should have a 5-paragraph essay, and I'm going to give you time again in class today, so I'm going to let you go at about 11:30 to do this. 3 substantive examples, a thesis, and a logical conclusion. And I put a due date. I've put these instructions so you have them both on the PowerPoint, but I've also put them on D2L in the Dropbox for your reference, so you can look at those if you want. So there are 3 broad categories of business-to-business markets. There are for-profits. These are people that manufacture and sell goods and services. There are nonprofits. Some nonprofits also manufacture goods and services or provide services. And then there are governmental entities that provide largely services, although sometimes they manufacture products. What is it that you get from cities, for example? They're not really manufacturing a product, although they are, because they have to treat it. Well, in Oklahoma, if you live in a city or community, you probably get your water from what? The city. And they have to provide that to you. So they all provide goods and services. The difference is the motivation providing those goods and services. Governments exist for the benefit of their people or their citizens. Nonprofits exist to promote a cause or idea or help a specific group. For-profits, their purpose is to what? Make money for their owners, for their shareholders, for their owners of the DBA or partnership. Industrial markets. These are ones that produce raw goods that are usually used in the manufacturing process for other sales or services that are made. There are 7.7 million entities in the industrial market. 75% in the United States, we've entered into a post-industrial economy, and so 75% are now service firms selling things like insurance, communication, legal services. And this is where the biggest growth is going to be in the post-industrial world. For most of you, you will be engaged in data-driven markets. I think I told you in a previous lecture. If not, I'll tell you now, and redundancy, of course, is good because it reinforces the idea. According to the 3 exposure hypothesis, I have to tell you something 3 times for you to remember it. 50% of the jobs that are in existence in the United States today will not be in existence in the next 10 years. Those that will be in existence are those that involve information services. And so it's these intensive intellectual endeavors that are really going to be the backbone of the American economy. 25% sell primarily physical goods, things like General Motors, Ford, but even a big portion of those businesses, what is one of the biggest branches of General Motors? Well, it's actually General Motors Credit, GMAC. and the financing arm of their business. So that's a service. So a lot of sales will involve what we call a blended sale of goods and services. And one of the things that you need to be aware of for this is whether or not that sale, as you go into the market, is going to fall in the UCC, within the ambit of the UCC and the requirements of the UCC for contract law. If it is primarily a sale of goods, the UCC, with services ancillary to the sale of goods, the services ancillary will be covered by the UCC. If it is primarily a service in which the sale of goods is tangential to the service, so for example, as a lawyer, I provide tangible goods to my products in the form of documents. If somebody comes to me for a will, they're going to get a document from me that says, you know, this is my last will and testament. But is that really the product? Do they value the thing in and of itself, the piece of paper that I'm giving them? No, what they really value is what?
What they get from it?
Yeah, the knowledge that goes into drafting that document and the peace of mind that they get from knowing that when they die, their crazy Uncle Al or their smelly cousin Bob is not going to inherit their stuff, that it's going to go to somebody that they actually like and not somebody that they don't like, simply by dying intestate. Now, let's think about something else that's more complicated. So that's primarily a service. A sale of goods would be strictly the sale, for example, of a used car. That's strictly a sale of goods, right? That's going to be covered under the UCC. What about the sale of food at a restaurant? Is that primarily service, or is it primarily a good? And the reason that this may be important to think about, because as I've said before, we have to integrate all of this stuff, so understanding how things like the environmental scan and understanding the regulatory environment, how that applies in these kinds of situations, becomes important. If that's primarily a sale of goods with services attached, you get things like the implied warranty of merchantability. What does that mean? Well, with regard to food, it means that they shouldn't sell you tainted food. That it should be fit for eating, right? But if it's primarily a service, you may not get that implied warranty of merchantability. So is a restaurant, is the sale of food primarily a service, or is it primarily sale of goods? You think it's a sale of goods, really? Yeah, why is it that you go out to eat? Yeah, I think it may be primarily a service. It's the convenience of not having to cook it yourself, or getting the service of a chef who prepares it in a way that you may not be able to or familiar with, things like that. I don't know. So these are things that you have to think about. So as you think about these things, again, look at how you can integrate this stuff across these various chapters. Resellers. There are 1.5 million retailers. So resellers fall into retail and wholesale, generally. They buy products and resell them without any reprocessing of the products. They may cut them down, so if a wholesaler buys products in bulk to sell to a retailer, they might divide it from a gross into pallets, and from pallets into smaller units like cases, and then they'll be sold by the retailers as individual things. So if you go, for example, to Sam's buys Reese's Peanut Butter Cups, which is my favorite type of candy, in what? Well, they buy them in huge amounts or huge volumes or grosses. They come on pallets, and then they bring in those pallets are divided into what? Various cartons or boxes, and then those boxes contain individually wrapped Reese's. And what you want as a business consumer buyer is just, you want one Reese's. You don't want an entire gross or a pallet or even a carton. Governmental. Governments buy all kinds of things, and they're important for marketing, and we can sell all kinds of stuff. And if you can become a governmental contractor, you can make a lot of money. And one of the things that the federal government does is if you are a small business, a minority-owned business, or a female-owned business, you can get preferential treatment in government contracts. So those are attractive things. In the United States, all told, there are over 89,500 entities at the federal, state, and local level. Now, from a constitutional standpoint, we only have two levels of government. We only have the federal government and state governments. But in reality, state governments, all local governments derive their power from the state and are given that by a grant of the sovereign from the state to those local governments. But in reality, they function as independent units, so selling to things like cities and counties and towns. School districts, rural water districts provide a rich source of activity and marketing for both businesses and consumers that we should be aware of. So we can measure domestic, global, and industrial trades and governmental markets. In the United States and the North American Free Trade Agreement under NAFTA, we have the North American Industrial Classification System. And there are a number of questions on this next exam regarding the North American Industrial Classification System, NAICS, between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. It allows you to study various segments of the market. It breaks them down by market share, the demand for goods and services, and the competition that's involved in those markets. So you should know something about it. So the questions will appear like, according to the NAICS, what does the first digit of the code stands for? So what it does is, in order to allow us to break down various segments and analyze those so we can determine whether or not we want to target them, it uses the 6-digit code. The first 2 digits represent, and so I've given you examples here. The first 2 digits represent a sector of the economy. For example, agriculture, mining, or construction. The code for construction is 23. The third digit in the code represents a subsector. So construction of buildings is designated by 6. So civil engineering, which would be things like bridges, would be designated as 7. The fourth digit in the group represents an industry group. So for example, not just construction of buildings, but residential buildings, as opposed to what? What would be a different segment under the fourth digit? So the fourth digit, residential, is 1. There would be a different commercial for commercial, right? Or industrial. So there's even a different classification in there, right? What's the difference between commercial and industrial? Okay, yeah. Can you put a warehouse, for example, if you go right out here to the corner of Bowman and 2nd Street, there's a Starbucks on that corner right across the street from the fire station, right? And there's also housing behind that. That housing is probably zoned R1 or R2, but that corner is zoned commercial. Could I put up a tanning rendering factory right there? Probably not. Why not? People wouldn't want the smell in the middle of the city, rendering hides and things like that in the middle. So there's a distinction there between sort of commercial, which that's a commercial building, versus industrial. The 5th designates a specific industry. So for example, the 4th is an industry group, residential building. The 5th would be like residential building construction. What would be an example? So you should think about these as, what would be a substantive example as you try to learn the code. What would be a substantive example of a residential building construction business? Contractors that build homes. What else would be a bigger example of a residential construction business?
Apartments?
Okay, apartments, but think about like a business that you go to. What? Somebody say Home Depot? I thought I heard somebody say Home Depot, right? Home Depot, what do they sell? Are they selling primarily to contractors who build large industrial stuff? No, they're selling primarily to people who build what? A lot of their business is actually home improvement. The 6th is the individual country level national industries, for example, single family residential housing, multifamily residential housing construction. And it allows us to determine growth in various sectors of the economy amongst the three partner nations in the North American Free Trade Agreement. It allows us to determine marketing opportunities that may exist within those sectors, the growth and potential for those marketing opportunities. There is a limitation. The 5-digit code is not available for countries that have too few organizations to exist. So for example, in the United States, we have a lot of different providers for cell phones. Even in some areas, in rural areas, you'll still find rural cooperatives that provide cell service for cell phones. And what those companies do is they buy basically space or bandwidth from larger companies. They repackage that service and then sell it to you. In Mexico, there's only really one provider. One of the wealthiest men in the world is a guy named Carlos Slim, and he basically has a monopoly on the telecommunications industry, or it did, until recently in telecommunications in Mexico. And so there wouldn't be further breakdown if there are too few providers to make a meaningful comparison among the countries. So characteristics of business-to-business marketing. The biggest characteristic is that the demand, and the most important that you should remember and think about for a test, is that the demand is derived. What does that mean? That the demand is derived. When you buy a Reese's peanut butter cup, again my favorite type of chocolate, sometimes those kinds of questions appear as bonus questions on tests, by the way, so you know when I say things like the fair is my favorite fall activity, the Oklahoma State Fair, Reese's peanut butter cups. What are you buying that Reese's peanut butter cup for? To eat it. Because it does what? It gives you great joy and happiness as you mix the chocolate and peanut butter together on your palate and taste it. And it, you know, if you're hungry, it serves to fill you up. So you're enjoying it for your own benefit. If I'm buying it as somebody who runs the vending machines here, for example, Coca-Cola has the vending contract, so they buy all kinds of products as well, right? They're not buying it for their own consumption, they're buying it because what? Right, to sell it, because you want it. So the demand is derived. It's not because they want it themselves, it's a derivative of a demand from a constituent or a consumer. The reason I use constituents here, why do I say constituents? Because if you look at nonprofits generally, we don't think of them as having customers. Who utilizes the Red Cross, for example? What does the Red Cross do? They assist in natural disasters. So who is utilizing the Red Cross? When there's a hurricane or a tornado, the Red Cross goes in and they do what? They set up shelters for people, they provide food and clothing and things like that for individuals that have been displaced as a result of having their house blown away by the tornado or swamped by the hurricane. And they're not charging for that, right? They don't go in and say, oh, you know, well, do you have $50,000 so that you can stay at the shelter and get food and clothing? No, if you could do that, you could go to what? You could go to the Marriott or the Hyatt or something like that and stay at the hotel. They have constituents. Governments have constituents, so they provide services to their citizens. The police don't come out and say, well, if you want us to investigate the crime, we're going to have to do what? Write us a check for $20,000. They don't do that. So constituents is a broader term, but in terms of what we're thinking about, we're going to be talking about in the business-to-business world, mostly customers that want to buy things. But police cars, or police organizations, for example, buy police cars not because they value the thing in and of themselves, but because it allows them to go on patrol and make neighborhoods safe and things like that. So it's derived demand. The size is typically larger. When the city of Guthrie, I used to be vice mayor of the city of Guthrie, buys cars, what do we buy? Are we buying one car at a time? When you go out and you buy a car, how many of you buy 2 or 3 of them? You're not Mitt Romney. When Mitt Romney lost the presidential election, he largely lost it because he was out of touch with people, and he said things like, I just love it. I'm back here in Michigan where they make cars. My wife has a couple of cars. She has a couple of Cadillacs. Well, most people don't have a couple of Cadillacs for themselves, right? You have what? One car. And it came out after that Mitt Romney had an entire garage where he has these things where they lift cars up. In New York City, they do this. In order to maximize space in parking garages, they'll put your car in a lift that will lift it up several stories, and then they can stack cars in there. He actually has a garage like that for his cars. Most people aren't like that. So you buy what? You buy one car. But when the city of Guthrie buys cars, what are we buying? We're buying a lot. So the size is typically larger. They're generally far smaller numbers. So for example, Ford sells directly to dealers. They don't sell directly to the consumer. There are 3,100 dealers in the United States who then again turn around and sell the cars to millions of customers. The buying objectives for businesses are different than your objective. You are buying because you want something, because you like it, you want to possess it, you need it to survive, things like that. The buying objectives for business are generally to increase profits, reduce cost, or increase revenues. For cities or other nonprofits or governmental entities, it may not be to increase profits, but it's to provide things more efficiently, to reduce costs and increase coverage. The buying criteria in business-to-business markets. Price is generally going to be a big buying criteria. Quality specifications are going to be important in those markets. So for example, if they want something that has very tight specifications for grade and quality, those kinds of things are going to be important. So Reese's probably buys peanut butter in huge amounts, and they want various grades. Peanut butter comes in different grades. Generally, what are you thinking of when you go buy peanut butter? You're only really faced with two choices. Does anybody actually buy crunchy peanut butter anymore? Do you still buy crunchy peanut butter? It's hard to find in some stores because it's not popular. But peanut butter comes in various grades, right? In various textures. What does Reese's want? What's the difference between the peanut butter in Reese's and Jif that you buy in the store? Anybody noticed? Yeah, the consistency is light. It's not quite as creamy. And so those kinds of specifications become important. Delivery schedules, time is of the essence clauses are typical in contracts. Environmental controls, issues, just-in-time inventory control, things can become issues in business to business, and so those kinds of contracts are very typical. Technical capabilities are important. Generally speaking, you don't care very much about the technical capabilities of producing Reese's, but if I'm going to buy peanut butter for manufacturing Reese's, I'm going to wonder about your technical capabilities and your ability to manufacture the quantity and quality of peanut butter that I want in the amount of time that I need it. Most of these involve, in the business to business, they involve a course of dealing. And so the contracts are generally long-term. You establish a relationship with a supplier and you continue that relationship for long periods of time. Usually a year or more are typical. For example, when we buy things here at UCO, we usually buy them on a yearly contract or bid because we don't want to have to go out and rebid all the time for large purchases. Production facilities and capacity then become issues. And so they're going to want to know things. If you want to sell to Sam's, for example, you have to go to Bentonville, Arkansas. You have to have a person there. They're going to want to know about when you go into business whether or not you can meet their demands. If you want to get into Sam's, one of the businesses that I know about that I had a guest speaker come talk to you guys was actually a UCO graduate. Her name is Mary Boothman, and she started a company called Maria Ray's. And her whole company was based on her husband saying, I think we ought to do this, and her saying, I don't think I want to do that, and him talking her into it. They moved back from California to Enid to take care of their elderly parents, and they couldn't get the kinds of Mexican food that they liked in California in Enid, Oklahoma. Every region sort of has different types of Mexican food. I was born in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and raised between Santa Fe and Oklahoma. And the New Mexico Mexican food is distinctly different from Oklahoma Mexican, which is much more influenced by what's called Tex-Mex, which originated where? In Texas. So California has a much different type of Mexican food, and they weren't able to find it. So her husband talked her into opening a restaurant called Maria Ray's in Enid, and people wanted their salsa. And so they started manufacturing their salsa. When they wanted to sell to Walmart, Walmart was very interested in whether or not they could actually meet the production requirement because they were a small company. I can remember when Head Country first, when I was getting my PhD in New Mexico, when Head Country was first, they got into local Walmarts here, and they were sold in Oklahoma and sort of northern Texas. but I can remember the first time I found Head Country in the Walmart in Las Cruces, New Mexico. I almost cried, because it's like the best barbecue sauce ever, and you couldn't get it in New Mexico. So they're going to wonder about your production facilities or your capacity if you're going to sell on a national level. So the relationships are usually long-term partnerships. There's formalized buying. For example, at UCO, we have a purchasing center with dedicated buyers who will write requests for proposals. You then have to think about users, who's going to use it, influencers. There are people, one of the things that George W. Bush was criticized for was he said, "I'm the decider." And people didn't think that was a real word. And it turns out in buying centers there are. There are people who are the deciders. At UCO, for example, one of the things you have to know is that there are only 2 people that can sign a contract for over $5,000. Now, obviously, when we bought a learning management system here, for example, professors are important and students are important because we're going to be the end users of this, but we aren't the ones who can ultimately decide whether or not a purchase is going to be made. Who can do that? Ultimately, the decider in our buying center at UCO is 2 people. It's the Vice President for Administration and Finance and the President. Those are the only 2 people that are designated to be able to sign contracts. You also have to understand the gatekeepers and the gatekeeping process. So at UCO, who are the gatekeepers? Well, they're the buyers that sit in our purchasing department and write those RFPs. They're the ones who are going to initially screen RFPs to determine whether or not those contracts or those requests for proposals that you submit meet the technical specifications for our purchase at UCO. So you have to get past them, but they're not the ultimate deciders. So understanding this becomes critically important. It's one of the reasons that if you go into the sales major, we have you take a class in purchasing, because it's understanding that other side of the transaction. The situation and classes of buying are going to impact the way the buy occurs. If it's a totally new buy, when I started teaching here at UCO, we didn't have, 22 years ago, we didn't have an LMS. That was something that was completely new. The first time we bought one, that was a huge decision, and it involved a lot more research on our part than when we have gone 20 years with having LMSs. We knew who was out there in the field, for example, D2L, Moodle, WebCT, Blackboard, things like that. So a new buy involves a lot more research and intensive study on the part of the business because it involves a greater risk. If it's a straight rebuy, so we order light bulbs all the time. We order sort of the same light bulbs all the time. So we're not going to use as much or invest as much in that kind of buying decision as we would for a new buy. And then a modified rebuy. What happens that changes? Well, actually when we buy like an LMS, it's generally a modified rebuy because what happens in the market? Different features come out, and different needs come out. So when we first started buying LMSs at UCO, we weren't really involved heavily in online teaching. If you wanted to take classes off campus, we did that through what was called correspondence at that time. And so it wasn't terribly important. What you needed for our LMS was basically sort of a gradebook feature and a communication feature. Now that we do online classes, what do we have to have? Well, it's a lot more sophisticated because we want to be able to integrate with textbook publishers' content on our platform fairly easily. We want to be able to import tests from the publishers into our learning management system. And so it's become a much more complex process as time has gone by. So that's a modified rebuy example. So in the buying decision, they go through sort of the same stages that you go through in consumer. There's a problem recognition. What made us decide we needed an LMS? Well, other schools started developing them or having them, and students talked about them, or professors went to conferences and saw them. And so we became aware that we needed this thing that would help us more efficiently administer our classes. So problem recognition. Then we went through an information search. Generally, this is much more in-depth and detailed at a business-to-business level than you're going to have for a business-to-consumer. Consumers oftentimes just use their evoked set, whereas in business-to-business, we're going to have a much more intensive information search. Then generally evaluate alternatives. There's oftentimes fewer suppliers. So using the LMS example, how many suppliers are there? There's only about 5. Whereas if you want a candy bar, what kinds of candy bars can you get? You're not just stuck with Reese's, you can get what? Mounds, Almond Joy, Payday. Why are you looking at me like that? You don't like almonds. You don't like Almond Joy and coconuts. There's a lot of different choices. Then you make your purchase decision. It usually takes a lot longer. So from the time we started recognizing that we needed to go to a new learning management system when they decided they were going to shut down WebCT, Blackboard was not going to support it, it took over a year. Whereas if you're going to buy food for lunch, you'd starve to death if you waited for a year to figure that out, right? And then the post-purchase behavior, it's highly formalized and generally monitored with very formalized feedback loops. Any questions on business to business? All right, well, I'm going to give you the rest of the time to either work on your critical thinking project, or if you have to drive, since the weather's getting bad, to head home and work with your groups online or however you want. Again, if you feel cheated, you let me know, and we'll stay late on Thursday when the weather's not bad. Yes, ma'am.
What is the critical thinking challenge?
I put a due date in there, I think it's next Tuesday. That's what I think I put in.